Hello and welcome to this PIR live event webinar brought to you in part by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Ben Hobbs and I will be your host today. If you're joining us live, remember that you can ask questions at any time by clicking Q&A, which is located near the bottom center of your screen, and typing your questions into the pop-up window. I will relay these questions to our guests during the Q&A section of our webinar. If you see a question in there that you would like answered as well, you can prioritize that question by clicking the thumbs up icon just below. So today our guest is Dr. Paolo Sanzo, Associate Professor in the School of Kinesiology at Lakehead University. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sanzo. I'll let you take it from here. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you just fine. Just getting some things ready here.
Oh, perfect.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, Ben, and welcome to everybody across Canada that are joining us for our presentation today. My name is Dr. Paolo Sanzo, and I'm an associate professor at Lakehead University. I teach in the School of Kinesiology, and I teach at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to highlight some of my areas of research and education, specifically in relation to the area of concussion, as well as a little bit of a tour of our laboratory and facility. So first of all, I kind of wear two hats. One is I am a physiotherapist, meaning that I am a clinician and I treat individuals with different injuries, including concussion, as well as I'm a professor here at Lakehead University teaching in two different programs. Now, my area of research primarily is focused on the clinical area. That is, individuals that have different injuries that might be sport related, how we treat those injuries from a rehabilitation perspective. And I look at the biomechanics of those injuries, whether it's an upper extremity, a lower extremity, or an injury involving the spine, the neck, or the low back area. Some of my projects involve the use of shockwave therapy, uses of therapeutic taping, and concussion. And that's what I'm going to really focus on today. And what I use is I use a variety of different types of measurement techniques in my experiments. I use force plates to try to measure the different impacts and forces that occur with some of these injuries. I also use different electrodes that we put on the skin. This measures what the muscles do and some of the electrical activity in those muscles. And we also combine that sometimes with motion capture, different video equipment. Sometimes we use all of these together. Now, if we think about concussion specifically, it can be the result of either a direct or an indirect force that causes the brain to collide with the skull. Now, if you think about the brain, essentially it sits within the skull, and within the skull there's also some fluid. So the brain swooshes around. Now, it doesn't have to be a direct blow to the head directly. You could actually get hit in the leg, you can get hit in the arm, and that can indirectly affect the brain. And what it does is it causes essentially a temporary disturbance of the brain and its ability to function normally. And what happens afterwards is a fairly complex process that we'll try to break down and look at. Now, essentially, when we look at the brain following this kind of an injury, it changes shape. If we look at the picture of the brain that we have pictured on the screen here, it is a slice.
Paul, just stop me for a moment. We actually don't have your slideshow up right now.
Oh, okay. Let me do that again then. Are you able to see it now?
There we go. Now it's there.
So if we look at the shape of the brain here as it changes following this type of a collision, and if we open up the brain, you'll see that the brain is colored white and gray, probably looks a bit more of a beige color. Now, essentially what happens with a concussion is that there's areas in the white part that become damaged. Now, this white area essentially is a communication system where the brain talks to other areas of the body. For example, there might be an area of the brain that controls the arm, an area of the brain that controls the leg, an area of the brain that controls memory, speech. If that area of the brain is damaged, then essentially what it produces a change in the function for that individual. It's also very unique. That is, if you had one and your friend or your classmate had exactly the same injury, they could present quite differently. So it can be very variable. And even if you've had 1 or 10 concussions, every single one of them could be very, very different. Now, if we look at how often this occurs, the prevalence, it's quite common. There's about 1.6 to 3.8 million concussions that are related specifically to sport that occur in the United States. Now, if we look at the numbers in Canada, they're quite similar. On average, there's about 600 out of every 100,000 people per year that sustain a concussion. And if you are a girl, it's twice as likely for it to occur in a female as compared to a male. And if you're an athlete, there's about 5 to 10% of athletes every year that will have and sustain a concussion for a variety of different reasons. Now, if you think about where and when does this commonly occur? If you're a male athlete, the most common sport that this is going to occur in is football. There's a 75% chance of you sustaining a concussion if you participate in football. If we look at girls, on the other hand, soccer is the most common sport with concussion. And this kind of surprises individuals sometimes with a 50% chance. 78% of these concussions that do occur during games as opposed to practices. Now, when we look at these numbers, we really don't know exactly how many concussions actually occur. And part of that is because of underreporting. That is, sometimes individuals don't even realize they've had a concussion. Sometimes they ignore the concussion, and they ignore it for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes they don't want to tell their parents, they don't want to tell their teacher, their friends, their teammates, because they might feel that they might let them down. They may also not want to lose that position on that team, or in some cases, if it's an elite athlete, a professional athlete, and they're getting paid for that, there's a fear that they might lose the income that it brings to them. Now, what are some of the risk factors? That is, who is more likely to sustain a concussion? Well, it depends on your age, and kids are more likely than adults to sustain concussions. It also depends upon your concussion history. That is, have you had a concussion in the past? Has it occurred 5 times, 10 times? Because that poses a greater risk. And it might depend upon the sport that you play. And if you look at some of these contact sports, football, rugby, or soccer, and I can add a variety of other different pictures, that puts you in a different category with a higher risk. Now, if we look at some of the biomechanics of these, that is, if we look at why some of these things occur. If you look at football, for example, there's about 900 to about 1,500 blows that occur to the head during a season. Now, if we think about boxing, which you would think this definitely must have a concussion risk, the speed with which a punch is thrown on average is about 20 miles per hour. Basically a slow-moving car. But if you think about a football tackle, the average tackle is about 25 miles an hour. Now, this is the surprising one. What do you think it would be when you had a soccer ball? Surprisingly, it's 70 miles an hour. It's a lot higher. Now, essentially, once this collision or concussion occurs, it's a complex process that occurs within the brain. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm not going to go into all of the details that occur, but it creates a crisis. And essentially, a lot of proteins are released within the brain itself, and it creates a variety of different symptoms. That is, the individual might feel confusion, they can't remember things, their head might hurt, they might feel dizzy and have some balance issues. They might feel very irritable and frustrated that they can't do what they normally would. They might also be sad in some cases. They can't participate with their friends or their teammates or their family. And this sometimes leads to trouble sleeping. Some cases they sleep all of the time, or in some cases they can't sleep at all. The nice thing about this is that 80 to 90% of the time, if you're an adult, this is going to go away on its own within a 10-day period, but this isn't the same for children. Anyone under the age of 18, it's probably going to take about 3 to 4 weeks for this to settle down. So the age, the frequency, and the timing of the concussion can impact on recovery. Now, what do we do to treat a concussion? Well, the biggest thing, especially early on, is rest. And rest doesn't mean putting your feet up on the couch and watching television all day. In fact, what you need to do is try to avoid schoolwork, driving, and spending time on screens, whether it's computers or telephones, but also avoiding physical exertion, chores around the house, or any physical activity that causes you to perspire. In the early stages, this is actually detrimental to the recovery. Now, what if you choose to ignore this and you go back to that activity too soon and you sustain a second concussion? Well, the worry there is that you then can develop what we call second impact syndrome. And this can actually result in death. It can cause more damage to the brain. So we really have to be aware of when a concussion is injured and treat it very, very carefully. What else can we do to treat persistent symptoms? Well, that's what we do in my lab. As a research scientist and as a clinician, we look at different types of treatments that can be used to help people with concussions. We also look at different ways of trying to recognize how concussions can be examined and what we can do for it. So now what I'd like to do is take you through my lab, and I've got a couple of videos that I'd like to show you guys. Now, one of the things that we do in our lab, and this is just one of several different projects, is we look at how to minimize or prevent concussions in a variety of different sports, one of which might be by wearing a helmet. And what I'm going to show you here is a video of one of my graduate students that's using an impactor. And there's a variety of different pieces of equipment that we have here. What we're looking at right now is what we call a horizontal impactor, and we can kind of see what happens to the skull. Now, the skull that you see there is actually the weight, the size of an average man or woman's skull, and we've put a helmet on there, and you can kind of see with a visor, we measure via a variety of different sensors how the helmet responds to that force. And you can see here in slow motion, we can videotape this as well to see what happens to the head and the neck, and the wire measures a variety of different speeds and forces that go through the head and whether the helmet does a good job or not. We also test whether the helmet actually can withstand 1, 10, or 100 impacts, because maybe we need to change the equipment at a certain stage. And we oftentimes don't do that. You sometimes only change your helmet based on does it fit or not. And that is probably not the best thing to do. So this is just a variety of different things. We also apply this to a lot of different other sports, cycling helmets. The interesting one that we're doing right now is fencing. We've actually got a student that's looking at a fencing mask and hitting it with a sword, which is going to probably be quite unique and a little bit different than what we've just described at this time. So I'll turn it back over to Ben and open it up to any questions that individuals may have.
Well, thank you. Just before we move into the Q&A, I'd like to remind everyone to direct their questions to the Q&A, which you can do by clicking the Q&A icon in the bottom center of your screen and typing your questions into the pop-up window. So our first question today comes from Miss Shutt's class, and she may have actually asked this, you may have answered this after she asked this question, but she's wondering, is there any sport in particular that has the highest concussion rate?
Thank you, and I'll just reiterate what I had said earlier. It depends if you're a boy or a girl. In boys, it's football, and in girls, it's soccer.
So is there any particular reason why it's broken up like that?
Generally, it's if we look at sports that involve some form of contact, so football, hockey, martial arts, boxing, those types of things, those are always going to be at the higher rate. And depending upon if you are a boy or a girl, you might have more of a tendency to participate in one type of a sport versus another. So that's why they sometimes will break it up depending upon the gender.
Okay. So you had mentioned before that perspiring could actually be detrimental to the recovery process. What about that makes it so harmful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So really it's related to exertion, meaning that if you are working hard, one of the responses that you get is that you will sweat. And what happens is that remember we said that there's an energy crisis that occurs with a concussion. And what happens is that the body tries to focus the recovery and the energy on the brain, but the brain doesn't have enough energy. So the minute you start physical activity, now what happens is that some of that energy has to go to you moving your arms, moving your legs, or whatever it is that you're doing. So as a result, we have even more energy diverted from the brain, creating even more of a crisis. So if you're doing an activity where you're not sweating, that's probably okay in the early stages. If you are exercising or doing something that is a bit more exertional, then that's probably too much.
Very interesting. So our next question today comes from Mike Matern's classroom, and they're wondering if you know what the concussion rate for hockey is, and number two, how do therapists determine the return to play protocol?
Yeah, so those are two excellent questions. So with regards to the concussion rate in hockey, it is also one of the higher sports. It depends sometimes on the age or the level. Is it single A versus double A versus triple A? Is it contact versus non-body contact? So it can kind of vary for a variety of different reasons. The second question, sorry, was again?
Oh, the second question was, how do therapists determine the return to play protocol?
Yeah, so excellent. So return to play or return to school or return to work involves a variety of assessments that that a clinician will do with that individual. And it sometimes might be asking questions. It might be having them do a variety of different tasks that could be related to balance, movements. It might be questions related to cognition, math, remembering certain things. And essentially what they do is they will score this in an assessment, a standardized assessment protocol that we use. And essentially we can use that. We can use that at baseline before even a concussion occurs, and then we can repeat that and sort of see, has any progress been made? We use that information combined with what we are sort of seeing and what the patient is reporting, whether they can return to that sport, school, or work.
Mr. Babcock's class is wondering, what are some long-term health effects of a concussion for children?
So that's, again, a great question. If it is just one concussion, there's really not a lot to worry about. Most people, as I said, spontaneously recover fairly quick within a couple of weeks. In particular for kids, it could take 3 to 4 weeks, but the person is usually fine. Now, if a person sustains a quite severe concussion, there might be some longer term ramifications, meaning that you've actually damaged the brain. And we call a concussion a minor traumatic brain injury versus a traumatic brain injury is something that's a little bit more major that has lifelong. But if you have it occur repeatedly, 5 times, 10 times, 100 times, what can actually happen is that the brain changes and it actually starts to demonstrate some things that we see later in life with some older individuals, having difficulties with memory, difficulty with balance, doing things. But we see this in a younger person, which would not be normal at that stage of their lives.
So certainly something we'd want to be careful of for sure. Our next question is from Mr. Vanderskott's classroom, and they're wondering if you think that baseline testing should be done for all levels of athletes at all levels.
You know, that's an excellent question and a debatable question because there is a big cost in doing baseline testing. Now, I'm a big proponent that I think that it's probably a good idea because it helps you to recognize some of these things later on. Otherwise, you have nothing to compare it to for that individual. So I believe and I'm a proponent that baseline testing is a good indicator and should be used in particular with contact sports.
Well, that's definitely something, in my experience, I would agree with as well, too. So our next question today, they're wondering, how long after hitting your head will concussion symptoms show?
Well, that's a good question, and it kind of depends. It's very, as I said earlier, it's individual and it's variable, meaning that some people can have some symptoms immediately. Their head might hurt, they might not be able to go back to that activity, they might know that something's not right. In other individuals, it might be more subtle, and it might come on, or they might notice, you know, I could do this, but I can't do that. I can remember things, but I can't physically do something. So it is quite variable. It can be as quickly as a couple of minutes post-injury. It could even be a couple of days or a couple of weeks after that injury has occurred.
If someone loses consciousness after a significant blow to the head, is this an indication that a concussion has certainly occurred?
Yeah, yes, and sometimes we can try to grade concussions, and what they will sometimes use in some of the grading schemes or grading mechanisms are whether the person lost concussion. And if they did, we know that this might be a little bit more serious, and we need to rule out that something else, some other type of damage has not occurred. But yes, that could be a pretty good indication that there's been some form of trauma to the brain. However, a person sort of passing out could also come from a variety of other reasons. So that person would need to be examined to make sure it wasn't caused by something else.
Our next question today is from Mr. Webster's classroom, and they're wondering, have you found the usefulness of SCAT protocols to be helpful, and why are physicians still unaware of these?
So yes, the SCAT protocol is very much used for, again, a variety of different things and used in a variety of different settings. And I think that more and more physicians and other healthcare providers are starting to use it. One of the reasons why they don't use it is because it does take a little bit of time to go through that whole assessment process. And sometimes they might recognize the assessment based on just a couple of things. in the end, they're going to prescribe rest anyways for the first couple of days. So they may sort of spend the time just doing that initial part of the examination and make the suggestion or recommendation and have that person come on back. But it's definitely being exposed to more and more healthcare providers, including physicians, and it is being used more and more.
So we talked a lot about concussions in sport, but is there other common methods that people often get concussions?
Definitely. In fact, probably the most common method of concussion is related to falls. And this could be a fall just walking across the snow, walking across a slippery surface, walking on uneven ground, and you just slip and either you strike your head directly against something or someone or an object, or it could just be the whiplash that occurs as a result of that. So falling is by far probably the most common mechanism of injury for a concussion to occur.
Is it possible for someone to end up paralyzed after they've received a concussion?
That's a great question. So that would not so much be related to the concussion itself, but essentially what would happen is that was an injury that occurred more to the spinal cord, which is below where the brain sort of sits. So depending upon where the trauma occurred in the spinal cord, if it was in the neck area versus more in the low back area, the person could lose the inability to move either both arms, both legs, or again, depending upon where the lesion was in the spinal cord, from that area down could be affected. But that would be a little bit different. It could occur simultaneously with the concussion injury, which is more directly to the brain itself.
So is there a specific number of concussions whereby someone may want to stop playing physical sports, or is it more generally just you want to keep it as few as possible?
Ideally, we want to have 0 concussions. That would be the optimal number. And there isn't, I'm okay if I have 1 versus 3 versus 10. It really depends upon, the severity of that concussion, the symptoms that you had afterwards, and whether those symptoms have all recovered. Ideally, we would want to minimize that number. In particular, if you're in a sport where, you're going to be receiving blows to the head repeatedly. It's definitely something that you have to evaluate very, very closely from a long-term perspective. It's not to say that you shouldn't participate in that sport or activity. We don't have the evidence that says that. We just know that there's a higher risk in those. But there's also individuals that participate in those sports that don't have injuries or don't have concussion-like symptoms. So again, we want to minimize them ideally to 0.
Now, is there any way we can minimize the chances of receiving a concussion when we're playing these sports?
I don't know that we can minimize all of the contacts that occur sometimes that we aren't expecting. Again, a slip and a fall, it's unexpected. You're not really able to prevent that necessarily. However, if there is certain equipment that's used in a sport, like a helmet, a visor, or a face mask, making sure that it's fitted appropriately, that it's, wearing it. Mouth guards have also been used to try to minimize some of the impact that goes through this area. There are rule changes that are implemented as well in certain sports to try to prevent some of these things from occurring, whether they use or remove body contact. Being physically fit, having good endurance, good strength, that certainly can help as well. And just again, really being aware of the changes that you're experiencing, not just from a physical side, but also mentally and emotionally and spiritually. Some of those things are a little bit more subtle, and we sometimes forget, I could participate in this physical task, but I can't do my math, or I can't remember what I'm reading. Those are a little bit different. So just being aware of those is going to be really important.
So Mr. Vanderscott's class is wondering, when did doctors start becoming more aware of concussions?
I don't think that it wasn't that they weren't aware of it before. I think with a lot of the media hype, in particular around high profile sport, that is probably what's really raised the attention of concussion in the general public. So it's not that physicians weren't aware of it. I think they were. I think it was more that the general public maybe wasn't as aware of it. This has now led to different movies that have occurred in Hollywood as well related to concussion. You hear it on the news a lot more. You hear it not just related to, high profile sports like, the NHL when Sidney Crosby had a concussion and had to miss an extended period of time, or professional football has been in the media a lot, in particular around, the Hollywood movie Concussion. That has definitely helped to raise the concern around concussion. By no means is it unique just to those two sports that I've mentioned, but that has definitely helped.
Now, does the amount of force to the head affect individuals differently depending on their age?
It does. The amount of force, the speed, the size of the individual, whether or not they're wearing a helmet or not, the type of helmet, these are all come into play on whether the concussion will result in an injury to the brain. And that's what we try to do in our lab and other labs around the country as well as around the world. We try to figure out sort of what speeds or what amount of force is required and whether some of that equipment actually does what it's intended to do. The interesting thing is, though, sometimes it doesn't take a lot of force, a lot of speed to cause a concussion in one individual versus another individual. They could have something extremely traumatic and you're thinking, how did they just walk away from that injury?
So Mr. Revender's classroom is wondering, why do concussions happen more often to girls than they do to boys?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure that we have necessarily an easy answer for that. Sometimes it could be related to structure. That is the size and the shape of the individual. And boys might have a bit more muscle mass, might have a little bit of a thicker or a different shape and size to the bones. That might help. Sometimes it's also related to hormonal changes that occur in girls as compared to boys. That might contribute also to the different presentations that we see in some of the symptoms that they experience as well.
So we're going to have to wrap up here in just a few minutes. But before I do, if I could just get you to talk maybe a little bit about why you got into this area of research, maybe what your career path looked like, and if you have some advice for students that are watching today and maybe considering a similar career in their future.
Certainly. Well, for me, really, the big interest was I played a lot of sports, as an elementary and high school athlete. And the first time I got an injury, I kind of thought, this is kind of neat. I was getting treatment by a physiotherapist and a doctor, and I thought, this is something that I would really like to do. So what I ended up doing was I ended up doing a Bachelor of Science degree in physiotherapy at the University of Toronto. Then what happened after that was I actually was exposed to research, and I ended up doing a master's degree at Lakehead University. And I thought this was kind of neat, combining sort of the injury side and the assessment and treatment side with research and trying to understand what to do best. I then went back and did a doctorate degree at Andrews University in the United States, and that's kind of led me to where I am. So now I kind of wear two hats. I continue to treat patients, but I also am a full-time academic teaching and doing research here at Lakehead University. So it's kind of the best of both worlds.
Well, that's all the time we have today. Thank you again for taking the time to share with us and to show us those videos from your lab and introduce us to that equipment, and for answering all of our questions.
Thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you for everybody for joining us here today.
So next week on PIR Live Event, we will be discussing global food security and farming for a sustainable future with Dr. Navin Ramankutty from the University of British Columbia. More information about these webinars and other PIR educational programs are available at pirweb.org. Thanks for tuning in and have a wonderful day.